The year was 1853, and the humid heat of July hung heavy over Saratoga Springs, New York. In the mid-19th century, this wasn't just a town, it was the playground of America's emerging aristocracy. The wealthy, the powerful, and the influential flocked to Saratoga to take the waters, race their horses, and, most importantly, to see and be seen. At the center of this social whirlwind was Moon's Lake House, a high-end restaurant situated elegantly on the shores of Saratoga Lake. It was a place where diamond-studded tycoons and silk-draped heiresses dined on fresh game and trout, expecting nothing less than culinary perfection. But the real magic of Moon's Lake House didn't happen in the dining room, where crystal glasses clinked and cigar smoke drifted toward the ceiling. It happened in the back, in the sweltering, chaotic heat of the kitchen, presided over by a man named George Crumb. George Crumb was not your typical 19th century chef. Born George Speck, he was a man of African American and Native American heritage, a member of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. In an era of deep racial division, Crumb commanded respect through sheer talent. He was known locally as a wild spirit, a former hunter and guide who knew the Adirondacks better than anyone, but in the kitchen, he was a master. He had a reputation for his game cookery, his trout, and his roasted potatoes. However, Crumb also had a reputation for something else, his pride. He was a man who took his craft seriously, and he did not take kindly to insults. On this particular bustling evening in August, the dining room was packed. The waiters were rushing back and forth, balancing silver trays, while the kitchen staff worked in a synchronized frenzy. Among the guests that night, according to local legend, was none other than Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Commodore himself was one of the richest men in America, a railroad tycoon known for his ruthless business tactics and his equally demanding personality. When a man like Vanderbilt ordered dinner, the kitchen went on high alert. The order came in, a standard dinner of Moon's famous fried potatoes. These were a staple of the time, thick-cut wedges of potato fried in oil and eaten with a fork, much like what we would call French fries or steak fries today. Crumb prepared the dish with his usual expertise, and a waiter whisked it away to the dining room. In the kitchen, the rhythm of chopping and searing continued. But moments later, the swinging doors burst open. The waiter returned, looking nervous, the plate of potatoes still in his hand. "He sent them back," the waiter said, hesitating to look Crumb in the eye. Crumb looked up from his station, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sent them back? Why?" "He says they're too thick. He says they're soggy and not cooked through enough." Crumb frowned. He knew how to cook a potato, but swallowing his irritation, he took the plate back. In the hospitality business, the customer is always right, even when they're wrong. Crumb grabbed a fresh batch of potatoes. He sharpened his knife and cut this batch thinner than the last. He fried them longer, ensuring they were golden and hot, and sent them back out. The kitchen staff held their breath. A few minutes passed, then the doors swung open again. The waiter looked even more terrified this time. "He sent them back again, chef." The noise in the kitchen seemed to drop away. Crumb stared at the plate of perfectly good potatoes. "Too thick," the waiter repeated the customer's complaint. "He says they are still too thick and too soft. He demands them thinner." This was the spark that lit the fuse. For a chef like George Crumb, this wasn't just a complaint, it was an insult to his skill. He had prepared the dish the way it was meant to be prepared, the way the French style of cooking dictated. The customer wasn't asking for quality. He was being difficult for the sake of being difficult. The heat of the kitchen, combined with the arrogance of the dining room, pushed Crumb over the edge. If the Commodore wanted thin, Crumb decided, he would get thin. He would get potatoes so thin that they would be impossible to eat with a fork. He would get potatoes so dry and brittle that they would shatter at the touch. George Crumb wasn't going to cook dinner anymore. He was going to cook a lesson. With a mischievous glint in his eye, Crumb grabbed a new potato. He didn't use his standard chopping technique. Instead, he took his sharpest knife and began to shave the potato into slices that were nearly transparent. They were as thin as paper. "You want thin?" Crumb muttered to himself, slicing furiously. "I'll give you thin." He tossed the ghostly wafers of potato into the boiling oil. Because they were so thin, they didn't fluff up like a fry. They curled and hardened instantly. He watched them turn a dark golden brown, frying them until every ounce of moisture had been obliterated. They were hard as rocks. But Crumb wasn't finished. To ensure the dish was completely inedible, he grabbed the salt cellar. In those days, salt was used for seasoning, but Crumb decided to use it as a weapon. He showered the fried crisps in a mountain of salt, enough to make anyone gag. He plated the mess, a pile of greasy, brittle, overly salty shards, and handed it to the waiter. "Take this to him," Crumb commanded, a smug smile playing on his lips. "These should be thin enough." The waiter hesitated, looking at the strange creation, but he feared the chef more than the customer at that moment. He walked out to the dining room. Crumb stood by the kitchen door, peering through the small window, waiting for the explosion. He expected the wealthy tycoon to take one look at the plate, throw his napkin down, and storm out. He was expected to be fired. He was ready for the fight. In the dining room, the plate was placed before Vanderbilt. The tycoon looked down at the curly golden chips. They looked nothing like potatoes. He picked up his fork and tried to stab one, but the chip shattered instantly. You couldn't eat these with a fork. This was a violation of all dining etiquette. Vanderbilt paused. He picked up a piece with his fingers, a scandalous move in polite society, and inspected it. Then he popped it into his mouth. In the kitchen, Crumb watched. He saw Vanderbilt chew. He saw the crunch. And then something incredible happened. Vanderbilt didn't spit it out. He didn't yell. A look of surprise crossed his face. He took another chip. Crunch. Then another. He smiled. "These are delicious," the tycoon exclaimed, reaching for more. "Excellent. Better than the first ones." The plan had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Crumb had tried to make the worst potato dish in history, and he had accidentally created a masterpiece. Vanderbilt began offering the chips to the other guests at his table. Soon the sound of crunching filled the dining room. Other diners looked over, curious about the golden piles being devoured by the richest man in the room. They began signaling the waiters, "I'll have what he's having." Back in the kitchen, the mood shifted from tension to confusion and then to panic. The orders were flooding. Everyone wanted the crunchy potatoes. George Crumb, the man who had just tried to sabotage his own customer, now found himself frantically slicing potatoes paper thin to keep up with the demand. That night, a legend was born. They didn't call them potato chips at first. They were named after the place of their birth, Saratoga chips. News of the new snack spread like wildfire. Moon's Lake House became famous not just for its game or its lake views, but for Crumb's accidental invention. Wealthy tourists from New York City and Boston would travel specifically to Saratoga to get a box of these chips, a complimentary treat that kept customers coming back for decades. For a long time, potato chips remained a delicacy for the rich, primarily served in restaurants because they had to be peeled and sliced by hand. It wasn't until the 1920s, with the invention of the mechanical potato peeler, that chips could be mass-produced for the average American. But the soul of the snack remained right there in that sweltering 1853 kitchen. It is a uniquely American story. It is a tale that combines the arrogance of the Gilded Age elite with the defiant spirit of a working-class chef. It reminds us that sometimes our greatest successes don't come from careful planning or corporate strategy. Sometimes they come from a moment of pure, unfiltered frustration. George Crumb died in 1914, but his legacy is alive in every lunchbox, picnic basket, and Super Bowl party across the nation. Today, Americans consume over 1.8 billion pounds of potato chips every year. And to think, none of it would have happened if one wealthy customer hadn't been so picky and one brilliant chef hadn't been just petty enough to try and teach him a lesson. The potato chip wasn't invented to be loved, it was invented to be hated. And that, perhaps, is what makes it taste so good.